Welcome to Liturgy of Whispers, where the forgotten corners of history breathe again, where the silences between documented facts carry the weight of things no official record dared to preserve. Tonight, we travel to the winter of 1938, deep inside the frost-bitten heart of Montana, to a place called Harlan Creek, a mining village so remote, so completely swallowed by the Bitterroot Mountains that the outside world only learned of what happened there weeks after the event itself. And what happened there on the night of November 14th, 1938, remains one of the most unsettling, most psychologically layered mass evacuations ever recorded in the history of American frontier communities. Not a flood, not a fire, not an avalanche bearing down the mountainside. Something else. Something that caused grown men who had spent their entire adult lives descending into the earth's black throat every single morning without flinching. Men hardened by dynamite and dust and the constant proximity of death. To abandon half-eaten dinners, leave lanterns burning on tables, and flee into absolute darkness without a word of coordinated instruction. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. Dinner plates still warm, coffee still steaming in tin cups, children's wooden toys left exactly where small hands had placed them, a village frozen mid-breath, like a photograph taken at the precise second before something irreversible occurs. Before we go any further, I want to invite you to leave in the comments below where you are watching this from and the exact time you are listening to my voice right now. There is a reason I ask. By the end of this story, that detail will matter to you in a way you cannot yet anticipate. Harlan Creek did not appear on most maps circulated in 1938. It existed because the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company needed it to exist. A company town built entirely around the extraction of copper ore from a series of deep vertical shafts bored into the mountain's eastern face, beginning in 1924. The village itself had been constructed in 3 phases between 1924 and 1931, growing from a temporary work camp of canvas tents and salvage timber into a semi-permanent settlement of 47 structures. There were residential cabins arranged in 4 rows, a company commissary that doubled as the social center, a one-room schoolhouse that served children between the ages of 5 and 14, a medical station staffed by a single company physician named Dr. Ellsworth Crane, and a foreman's office that sat slightly apart from the rest of the settlement on a small natural rise in the terrain, as if distance from the workers was itself a form of authority. By November of 1938, Harlan Creek had a registered population of 212 people. Miners, their wives, their children, a school teacher named Agnes Pollard who had come from Missoula, the company doctor, 2 men employed specifically as equipment mechanics, a cook named Bertram Lyle who ran the commissary kitchen, and a rotating security guard employed by the company whose primary function was not protection from outside threat, but the prevention of ore theft. These were not transient people. Many families had been in Harlan Creek for over a decade. Children had been born there. There was a cemetery on the western edge of the settlement containing 11 graves, 7 adults, 4 children, which tells you something essential about the depth of roots a community can grow even in the most inhospitable soil. 212 people who had built something resembling permanence in a place designed by its corporate architects to be temporary. That tension between the human impulse to root and the industrial machine's indifference to that impulse is important context for everything that follows. The autumn of 1938 had been difficult before November arrived. The mining company had reduced wages twice since August, citing falling copper prices on the national market, a consequence of broader economic pressures that were themselves consequences of a depression that had already been grinding American working families into dust for nearly a decade. There had been a meeting in the commissary in early October where the foreman, a man named Gerald Purcell, had addressed the assembled miners and explained the situation in the flat, rehearsed language of someone delivering news they had not authored and felt no personal responsibility for. 3 men had attempted to leave Harlan Creek in September, intending to find work elsewhere, and had been reminded by Purcell that their housing, their food supply, and in 2 cases their outstanding company-issued loans, made departure financially ruinous. This was a common mechanism of control in company towns throughout the American West during this period. Debt as architecture, obligation as invisible wall.
The miners of Harlan Creek were not enslaved in any legal definition the courts of 1938 would have recognized, but they were not entirely free either. They occupy that gray, suffocating space between those two conditions that American industrial history has never examined with the discomfort it deserves. Dr. Ellsworth Crane kept a personal journal throughout his time at Harlan Creek, and it is through the surviving pages of that journal, 17 pages recovered by a Forest Service ranger named Thomas Aldicott in the spring of 1939, found inside the medical station beneath an overturned examination table, that we have our most intimate window into the psychological atmosphere of the village in the weeks leading up to November 14th. Crane wrote on October 28th, 11 days before the evacuation, that he had treated 4 miners in a single week for what he described as severe sleep disturbances accompanied by auditory hallucinations. He used clinical language, as doctors do, but even through that professional distance you can sense something beneath the words, a slight tremor in the sentence structure, a tendency to circle back to details he had already recorded, as if repetition could neutralize them. He noted that all 4 men reported hearing sounds they could not identify coming from below the deepest active shaft, Shaft 7, which had only been opened 6 weeks earlier, and extended further into the mountain than any previous excavation at Harlan Creek. He recorded their descriptions carefully. Not mechanical sounds, not the settling of rock under pressure, which experienced miners recognize instinctively and file away without alarm. Something rhythmic, something almost, one of the men had said, and Crane underlined this in his journal, almost like breathing.
Dr. Crane did not report these complaints to Foreman Purcell immediately. This is significant. In a company town, the company physician occupied a peculiarly compromised position, employed by the same corporate entity that employed the men he treated, answerable to the same hierarchy that determined whether the village continued to function at all. To report widespread psychological disturbance among the workforce was to invite scrutiny that could result in production slowdowns, mandatory rest periods, or worse, an investigation that might conclude the men were simply unfit for continued employment. Crane understood this calculus intimately. He had been at Harlan Creek for 4 years by the autumn of 1938, long enough to understand that his role was as much managerial as medical, to keep the men functional, to minimize disruption, to translate human suffering into the least economically costly form of intervention available. So he prescribed rest where he could, administered mild sedatives from his limited pharmaceutical supply to 2 of the 4 men, and wrote in his journal rather than in the official medical log, which he knew Purcell reviewed at the end of each month. That decision, to keep these observations private, would later become the subject of considerable ethical debate among the handful of historians who eventually pieced together the Harlan Creek story. But standing inside the reality of 1938, inside the specific gravity of that village, and that man's particular position within it, the choice feels less like a moral failure and more like a very human calculation made under impossible pressure. We judge the past most harshly precisely at the moments when it most closely resembles our present. By the first week of November, the reports were no longer confined to 4 men. Crane's journal entries from November 2nd through November 11th document a widening circle of disturbance that he struggled increasingly to contain within the boundaries of clinical language. 11 miners in total had now come to him with variations of the same complaint. Sounds from below Shaft 7, sounds that did not behave the way underground sounds behave, sounds that seemed to follow no pattern of echo or reverberation consistent with the known geology of the mountain. 2 of the men reported that the sounds appeared louder on certain nights than others, with no apparent correlation to weather conditions, seismic activity, or the intensity of the day's drilling operations. One miner, a man named Corcoran Blythe, who had been working underground mines since the age of 16, and who Crane described in his journal as among the most psychologically stable men in the village, told the doctor that he had pressed his ear against the rock face at the bottom of Shaft 7 on the evening of November 3rd and held it there for several minutes, trying to identify and categorize what he was hearing. He told Crane that the sound was not coming from within the shaft walls, it was coming from below the shaft floor, from somewhere beneath the deepest point the drill had yet reached. Blythe had not been sleeping for 4 days when he relayed this to Crane. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained level, his description precise and methodical, the voice of a man who is frightened but determined not to be hysterical about it.
which is in many ways a more unsettling register than open panic. Crane made a decision on November 5th that represented a significant escalation in his response to the situation. He wrote to the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company's regional office in Butte, composing the letter carefully over the course of an evening, walking a narrow rhetorical path between conveying the genuine seriousness of what he was observing and framing it in language that would not trigger the kind of corporate panic that might result in punitive action against the miners themselves. He described the situation as a cluster of anxiety-related sleep disorders, likely connected to the psychological pressures of the wage reductions and the approaching winter, a framing that was not entirely dishonest, since those pressures were real and certainly contributed to the vulnerability of men already disturbed by something they could not explain. He recommended that a geological survey team be dispatched to assess Shaft 7, suggesting that unknown subterranean voids or gas pockets might be producing the sounds, and that confirming or ruling out this possibility would restore worker confidence and productivity. The letter was sent via the weekly supply truck on November 6th. A response, had it been sent immediately upon receipt, would have taken a minimum of 10 days to arrive back at Harlan Creek. The evacuation happened on November 14th. The response never arrived in time to matter. What occurred between November 6th and November 14th fills the remaining pages of Crane's recovered journal with a density of observation that suggests a man writing faster than he normally would, pressing harder on the pen, as if urgency were a physical force acting on his hand. On November 8th, a miner's wife, Crane identifies her only as Mrs. Ferris, the wife of a man named Dale Ferris who worked the early shift at Shaft 7, came to the medical station at approximately 2 in the morning, accompanied by her 2 children, ages 7 and 9. She told her husband that he had not come home from his shift, that she had waited until midnight before going to check with the night crew, and that the 2 men on the overnight maintenance rotation at Shaft 7 had told her they had not seen Dale Ferris since she had descended into the shaft at the end of the regular evening shift at 6 o'clock. He had not signed out. His lamp had been returned to the equipment rack. This detail is important. The lamp returned, suggesting he had surfaced, suggesting he had stood in the equipment room and performed the routine act of replacing his lamp before vanishing. But Dale Ferris himself was nowhere in the village. Crane noted that Mrs. Ferris was not hysterical. She was, he wrote, extraordinarily calm in the way that people sometimes become calm when they have moved past the threshold of what ordinary emotion can process, and entered a state of suspended, almost administrative functioning. She simply needed someone to tell her what to do next. Crane had no answer for her. He gave her tea and let her children sleep on the examination table and sat with his journal and wrote, in letters slightly larger than his usual hand, a single line that appears alone on an otherwise empty page. Something is wrong with the mountain.
Dale Ferris was never found. Not that night, not in the weeks following the evacuation, not in the spring of 1939, when the Forest Service Ranger Thomas Aldicott made his careful inventory of what Harlan Creek had left behind. His name appears in the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company's employment records in the 1930 federal census, in a single photograph recovered from the Ferris family cabin, a square, slightly overexposed image of a broad-shouldered man standing in front of a pine tree with his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who shares his jaw and his serious, evaluating eyes. That photograph is now held in the Montana Historical Society's archival collection, cataloged under a reference number that places it between a land survey document and a receipt for mining equipment. The bureaucratic indifference of filing systems doing what no deliberate act of erasure could quite accomplish, making a man's existence feel incidental. His wife, Margaret Ferris, gave a statement to the Mineral County Sheriff's Office in December of 1938, 6 weeks after the evacuation, in which she described her husband as a methodical, unimaginative man in the most affectionate possible sense of those words. He did not drink, he did not gamble, he had never in 14 years of marriage done anything impulsive or inexplicable. She said this not as a woman defending her husband's reputation, but as a woman trying to communicate something precise and important to people she could already sense were not going to take her seriously. Dale Ferris did not disappear because of anything Dale Ferris did. That was the point she needed them to understand. Whatever removed Dale Ferris from the world did so from the outside. The sheriff who received Margaret Ferris's statement was a man named Howard Bleck, who had held the position of Mineral County Sheriff since 1931, and who by all surviving accounts was neither incompetent nor cruel, but was operating within the particular limitations of a rural law enforcement framework in 1938 that had no vocabulary, no protocol, and no budget for the kind of investigation the Harlan Creek situation warranted. Black drove up to the village himself in late November, navigating 30 miles of mountain road that had already received its first serious snowfall of the season, and spent 2 days walking through the abandoned settlement with a deputy named Carson Pruitt, taking notes in a small spiral-bound pad. His official report, filed December 3, 1938, runs to 11 pages and is a document that rewards careful reading precisely because of what it refuses to conclude. Black documented everything he observed with scrupulous accuracy: the abandoned meals, the personal belongings left behind, the livestock still penned and alive but distressed, the lanterns burned down to nothing, the unlocked doors, the children's drawings still pinned to the schoolhouse wall. He noted the returned lamp in the equipment room at Shaft 7. He noted that the entrance to Shaft 7 itself had been partially collapsed from the inside, which he described with what feels like carefully managed understatement as unusual. He interviewed every family from Harlan Creek that he could locate over the following 3 weeks, a population that had scattered across western Montana with the disorganized urgency of people who had left in darkness and had not, even weeks later, fully agreed on where they were going. And at the end of 11 pages of meticulous observation, Howard Black wrote his conclusion in 2 sentences. The evacuation of Harlan Creek on the night of November 14, 1938, appears to have been spontaneous and uncoordinated. The cause remains undetermined. Those 2 sentences have frustrated historians, journalists, and independent researchers for decades. Not because they are evasive. Black appears to have been a genuinely honest man doing his genuine best, but because they are accurate, and accuracy in the absence of explanation is its own particular form of torment. The cause remains undetermined. 8 decades later, despite the recovery of Crane's journal, despite the statements of dozens of former Harlan Creek residents collected over the years by researchers with more resources and more time than Howard Black possessed, despite 2 separate academic papers published in obscure journals of American frontier history in 1987 and 2003 respectively, the cause remains, in any strict evidentiary sense, undetermined. What we have instead of a cause is a constellation of testimonies, individual human accounts that overlap and diverge and contradict and confirm each other in the specific pattern that characterizes genuine memory as opposed to coordinated fabrication. People who are lying tend to agree too much. People who are telling the truth tend to agree on the center and diverge on the edges, because the center is what happened, and the edges are where individual perception and individual psychology begin to color experience differently. The testimonies from Harlan Creek survivors have exactly this quality. They agree on the center. They diverge, sometimes wildly, on the edges. The center, the thing that every single survivor account confirms without exception, is this. On the night of November 14, 1938, at a time that most witnesses estimated as somewhere between 7 and 8 in the evening, something happened at or below Shaft 7 that caused the entire population of Harlan Creek to leave. Not in a group, not following a leader, not in response to an alarm or a command or any identifiable organizational trigger. They left individually, in family units, in whatever they were wearing at the moment it happened, taking almost nothing, moving away from the shaft and away from the village and into the mountain darkness without lights in most cases, because the darkness outside was apparently preferable to remaining inside. Agnes Pollard, the schoolteacher from Missoula, gave a statement to a researcher named Patricia Gould in 1974. Pollard was 61 years old by then, living in Billings, entirely willing to discuss what had happened and notably unembarrassed by any of it, in which she described the moment of departure with a clarity that decades had apparently not dimmed. She said she had been in her cabin grading papers when she became aware of a sound she initially thought was wind moving through the gaps in the cabin wall. She put down her pen and listened. It was not wind. It had a consistency that wind does not have, a steadiness, an evenness of pressure that felt, she said, deliberate, as if it were directed. She sat with it for what she estimated as 2 or 3 minutes, and during those minutes she experienced something she struggled to describe to Patricia Gould across the distance of 36 years. Not fear, exactly, she said, but a complete and sudden certainty that she needed to not be where she was. Not panic. Certainty. As if the information had been delivered directly to some part of her that operated below the level of conscious reasoning, bypassing the normal process of evaluation and debate that precedes a decision, and arriving already made. She put on her coat. She walked out of her cabin. She did not lock the door. She did not go back for the papers she had been grading, or the small amount of money she kept in a tin box under her bed, or the photograph of her parents that sat on the windowsill. She simply walked away from the village in the direction of the main road, and as she walked she became aware that other people were doing the same thing. Not running, not calling out to each other, moving with the same quiet purposefulness she herself felt,
as if the entire village had received the same information through the same channel simultaneously, and had independently reached the same conclusion. She passed Margaret Ferris on the road, she told Patricia Gould. Margaret was carrying both children, one on each hip, which Agnes knew was physically demanding because the older child was 9 years old and not small. Margaret did not speak. Agnes did not speak. They walked together in silence for nearly a mile before either of them said anything, and what Margaret Ferris finally said, in a voice Agnes described as completely conversational, as if she were commenting on the weather, was, "I think it found whatever it was looking for."
Agnes Pollard did not ask Margaret Ferris what she meant by that. She told Patricia Gould in 1974 that the statement had not, in the moment, seemed to require clarification. It had landed with the weight of something self-evident, the way certain sentences do when they arrive in the precise psychological context that makes their meaning feel already understood, even before the mind has consciously processed the words. It was only later, in the days and weeks that followed, when Agnes was staying in a boarding house in the town of Superior, Montana, sleeping badly and eating less than she should have been, that she began to turn Margaret's words over in the way you turn a stone over to examine what lives beneath it. I think it found whatever it was looking for. The pronoun troubled her most. Not what it found, not where it found it. The it. The casual, unelaborated it, deployed by a woman who had spent 6 days not knowing where her husband was, spoken in a tone that suggested not conclusion, but confirmation, as if Margaret Ferris had been waiting for something she had already suspected was coming, and its arrival, terrible as it was, carried within it the grim satisfaction of having been right. Agnes never spoke to Margaret again after that night. Margaret Ferris relocated to her sister's home in Spokane, Washington in early 1939, and the historical record loses her there. Her children, if they are still alive, would be in their 80s now. If they remember anything of Harlan Creek, they have not chosen to share it with anyone whose account has survived into the present. The question of what precisely happened at Shaft 7 on the night of November 14th is the question that every investigation, every research effort, every late-night conversation between the people who become obsessed with this story eventually arrives at, and then circles around without ever quite landing on. We have the physical evidence, such as it is. We have Bleck's report noting the partial collapse of the shaft entrance from the inside, a detail that mining engineers consulted by Patricia Gould in the 1970s found genuinely difficult to explain. A collapse from external pressure, from the weight of rock above bearing down on the shaft walls, produces a characteristic pattern of debris distribution that any experienced observer can identify. The collapse at Shaft 7 did not match this pattern. The debris was distributed as if the force that caused the collapse had originated from below, from within the shaft itself, pushing upward and outward rather than downward and inward. One of the engineers Gould consulted, a man named Robert Teschner, who had spent 30 years working underground mines across the American West, told her that the only natural phenomenon he could think of that might produce this kind of collapse from below would be a sudden and extreme release of pressurized gas from a previously unknown underground pocket, what miners call a blowout. Blowouts were not unheard of in deep shaft mining. They were dangerous, occasionally fatal, and they produced a very distinctive sensory signature, a percussive pressure wave, a smell of sulfur or methane depending on the gas composition, sometimes a visible displacement of dust and debris from the shaft mouth. Teschner said that a blowout large enough to partially collapse Shaft 7 from below would have been felt throughout the entire village as a physical event, a concussive impact against every structure in Harlan Creek, and would certainly have been sufficient cause for mass evacuation. But here is where the testimony diverges from the theory in a way that cannot be explained away. Not a single survivor account mentions a concussive impact, not one. Agnes Pollard did not describe a physical jolt or a pressure wave. She described a sound and a feeling. Corcoran Blythe, the experienced miner who had pressed his ear to the rock face at the bottom of Shaft 7 11 days before the evacuation, gave a statement to Sheriff Black in December 1938, in which he described the evening of November 14th with the same methodical precision he had apparently brought to everything in his life. He had been in his cabin eating dinner with his wife and their 3 children when he became aware that the sound he had been hearing from below the shaft for weeks had changed. Not louder, different. He struggled to find the right word for the difference, settling finally on the word closer. Not closer as in proximity,
He was not suggesting the sound had moved toward him through the rock, closer as in resolution, as if something that had previously been heard through distance and interference was now being heard clearly, without obstruction, as if whatever had been producing the sound had moved from one side of a barrier to the other side of that same barrier. He put down his fork. His wife looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. He told Bleck that no words were exchanged, that none were necessary, that his wife's expression told him she was hearing what he was hearing and understanding what he was understanding, and that they gathered their children and left the cabin within approximately 90 seconds of that moment. He did not look back at the village as they walked away. He told Bleck this specifically, with an emphasis that suggested it was important to him that Bleck understand he had made a conscious decision not to look back, that this decision had required some effort, and that he did not regret it. The sound itself, the sound that 17 miners had separately reported to Dr. Crane over the previous weeks, the sound that Agnes Pollard heard in her cabin walls, the sound that Corporal Blythe described as moving from one side of a barrier to the other side of that same barrier. This sound is described with remarkable consistency across all the accounts that reference it, which is itself a noteworthy fact given that the accounts were collected over a span of nearly 4 decades by different researchers with different methodologies. Consistency across time and across interviewer is one of the strongest indicators of genuine sensory memory rather than constructed narrative. What they all describe is a low, rhythmic, even sound that did not correspond to any mechanical or geological phenomenon they had previously encountered. Several of the miners, men with decades of underground experience between them, were explicit about this. They were not hearing equipment, not hearing rock movement, not hearing water, not hearing any of the catalog of subterranean sounds that experienced miners learned to identify and file away. What they were hearing did not belong to that catalog. Bertram Lyle, the commissary cook, who had no mining experience whatsoever and had come to Harlan Creek from Chicago in 1933 following a period of unemployment, described the sound in his statement to Bleck with the unencumbered directness of a man who had no professional framework to filter his perception through. He said it sounded like something very large, breathing very slowly, from very far below. He said this without apparent embarrassment or hesitation. He said it the way a man describes what he saw, not what he thinks he should have seen. Robert Teschner, the mining engineer Patricia Gould consulted in the 1970s, did not have an explanation for this. He told her that pressurized gas does not breathe. He told her that geological processes do not produce rhythmic, consistent, patterned sounds of the kind the Harlan Creek survivors described. He told her, in the careful language of a man who has spent his career in a discipline that does not reward speculation, that he could not account for what those people heard. He said this, Gould noted in her research journal, with the expression of a man who found the gap between what his expertise could explain and what the evidence suggested to be genuinely, personally troubling. He had been underground for 30 years. He knew what the earth sounded like from the inside. What Harlan Creek described was not it.
Patricia Gould was not a professional historian. This is worth establishing clearly, not to diminish her work, but to contextualize it, because the manner in which she came to spend nearly a decade researching the Harlan Creek evacuation tells you something essential about the kind of story this is and the kind of hold it takes on certain people. Gould was a high school English teacher from Missoula, Montana, who in 1971 read a brief 3-paragraph mention of the Harlan Creek incident in a locally published compendium of Montana frontier oddities, the kind of thin, spiral-bound book sold in gas stations and roadside gift shops, written by an amateur enthusiast with more passion than methodology, the sort of text that professional academics dismiss and ordinary people devour. The 3 paragraphs gave almost no detail. They mentioned the abandoned village, the left-behind meals, the mass departure into darkness. They cited no sources. They offered no explanation. They ended with a sentence that Gould later said she found impossible to move past. No official investigation was ever completed, and the people of Harlan Creek, when asked about that night, have been known to change the subject. That sentence lodged in her like a splinter. She was not someone who changed the subject. She was someone who taught 17-year-olds to read carefully, to ask what a text was avoiding as much as what it was saying, to understand that the shape of a silence is itself a form of information. The Harlan Creek silence had a very particular shape. She needed to know what it was made of. She began with the obvious sources, the Mineral County Sheriff's records, the Montana Historical Society's general collection, the archived editions of the regional newspapers that had covered the evacuation in November and December of 1938. The newspaper coverage was sparse and oddly uniform in its incuriosity, a quality Gould noted in her research journal with a mixture of frustration and fascination. The initial reports were factual and brief. Mining village abandoned, residents relocated, company investigating. There were no follow-up stories, no human interest pieces tracking the displaced families, no investigative reporting pressing the consolidated Harlan Mining Company for answers. In 1938, a mining company's relationship with regional press in a state whose economy was substantially dependent on the mining industry was not the adversarial relationship that journalism schools teach students to aspire to. It was closer to the relationship between a landlord and a tenant. The tenant could describe the apartment accurately, but understood instinctively which descriptions would result in consequences and which would not. Gould found one exception, a short column in the Superior Montana weekly paper dated November 28, 1938, written by an editor named Frank Cassidy, who had apparently either not received or chosen to ignore the informal pressure toward restraint. Cassidy wrote that the evacuation of Harlan Creek deserved serious investigation, that the mining company's public statements had been inadequate and evasive, that the disappearance of at least one worker, Dale Ferris, had received no meaningful law enforcement response, and that the people of western Montana deserved to know what had happened in their mountains. It was the last column Frank Cassidy wrote for that paper. The following week's edition carried a brief notice that Cassidy had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Gould visited Superior in 1972 and spoke to a retired printer who had worked at the paper in 1938. He told her Cassidy had not resigned. He had been asked to leave following a phone call between the paper's owner and someone at the mining company's Butte office whose name the printer either did not know or chose not to share. Cassidy himself had died in 1961. His family, if he had one, left no trace in the records Gould was able to access. The suppression of the Harlan Creek story, and suppression is not too strong a word, though it was suppression of the informal, economically motivated variety rather than any coordinated official conspiracy, meant that by the time Gould began her research in 1971, more than 3 decades had passed since the evacuation. Memories had faded or been deliberately set aside. People had built new lives in new places, and had constructed around the Harlan Creek episode the kind of psychological architecture that humans build around experiences too large or too strange to be comfortably integrated into an ordinary life narrative. Some of the survivors Gould tracked down were willing to talk, others were not. The ones who were not willing to talk were not, in Gould's assessment, evasive or deceptive. They were not hiding something they knew. They were maintaining a distance from something they had never been able to fully process, and revisiting it at the invitation of a stranger felt like being asked to put their hand back into a place they had spent years carefully withdrawing it from. Gould respected these refusals. She documented them in her research journal, not as dead ends but as data points. The shape of those silences, their consistency, their quality, told her something about the nature of the experience that had produced them. Agnes Pollard was the most forthcoming of the survivors Gould located, and their 1974 conversation, conducted over 2 afternoons at Pollard's kitchen table in Billings, recorded on a portable cassette recorder whose tapes Gould later had partially transcribed, is the richest single source we have for the interior experience of someone present at Harlan Creek on November 14, 1938. Pollard had thought about that night for 36 years by the time Gould sat across from her, and her thinking had the quality of someone who has returned to the same territory so many times that they know every feature of it intimately, but have still not been able to name what they are looking at. She was precise about the sensory details, the sound in the cabin walls, the feeling of certainty that arrived without passing through the normal gates of conscious deliberation, the walk away from the village in the dark with people moving around her in the same purposeful silence. She was less precise, and knew she was less precise, and was honest about this, about what she believed had caused those sensory details. She told Gould she had spent years trying to find a framework that could hold the experience without distorting it, and had concluded that no framework she had encountered was adequate to the task. She was not a superstitious woman. She did not, she told Gould carefully, believe in the supernatural in any conventional religious or folkloric sense. But she also could not make herself believe that what had happened at Harlan Creek was explicable within the boundaries of what she understood the natural world to contain. She occupied, she said, a position of genuine and permanent uncertainty about it, and she had made her peace with that uncertainty not by resolving it, but by accepting it as the honest response to an experience that resisted resolution. She told Gould one more thing during those 2 afternoons that does not appear in any of the formal accounts or official records, and that Gould included in her research journal with a note indicating she was uncertain whether to credit it fully or to treat it as the product of 36 years of memory working on an experience under considerable psychological pressure. Pollard said that as she walked away from Harlan Creek on the night of November 14th, at some point perhaps a quarter mile from the village, she had turned and looked back. Despite everything, despite the certainty that had propelled her forward, she had turned and looked back toward the village and toward Shaft 7, whose location she knew well enough to identify even in darkness by the silhouette of the equipment housing structure against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. And she said that what she saw, or believed she saw,
or has spent 36 years being unable to decide whether she saw, was a light. Not the warm amber light of a lantern, not the white beam of an electric torch. Something that she described, after a long pause during Gould's tape recorder captured only the sound of a kitchen clock and the distant noise of a billing street, as the wrong color for any light she had ever seen produced by any human source. She turned away immediately. She did not stop walking. She has never, she told Gould, been able to decide what it was. She has also never, in 36 years, been able to make herself stop seeing it when she closes her eyes in the dark.
The light that Agnes Pollard described to Patricia Gould in 1974 does not appear in any other survivor testimony collected before that date. This is important to establish clearly because the natural skeptical response to a detail of this kind, a strange light seen at the site of an already deeply anomalous event, is to suspect contamination, the process by which one person's account influences another's, creating false convergence around a detail that originated in a single imagination rather than a shared reality. Contamination is a genuine and well-documented phenomenon in eyewitness testimony research, and any responsible engagement with the Harlan Creek evidence has to take it seriously. But contamination requires exposure. It requires that the people whose accounts converge have had access to each other's accounts before giving their own. Agnes Pollard told her story to Patricia Gould in 1974. Gould's research was never formally published. It exists in a privately held archive that was donated to the University of Montana's Special Collections Department in 1998, 4 years after Gould's death, by her daughter. The archive was not cataloged or made accessible to researchers until 2006, which means that when a retired schoolteacher named Harold Voss, who had been 8 years old on the night of November 14, 1938, and had walked out of Harlan Creek holding his mother's hand in the darkness, gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker named Jesse Karn in 2009, he had no access to Agnes Pollard's account. He had no way of knowing what Pollard had told Gould 35 years earlier. And yet Harold Voss, 80 years old, sitting in a care facility in Kalispell, Montana, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that at his age, the effort of protecting himself from other people's disbelief is no longer worth making, described looking back at the village as his mother pulled him forward along the road, and seeing at the place where Shaft 7 was located, something he called a glow that was not the right color for fire or lamplight. He could not name the color. He said it was not a color he had seen before or since in any natural or artificial context. He said he had been 8 years old and had not had the vocabulary then to describe it, and was not certain he had the vocabulary now. But the glow had been there. He was certain of that. Certain in the way that only the memories which have been carried the longest and examined the most carefully become certain, not with the brittle confidence of recent recollection, but with the settled, unshakable quality of something that has been tested against every possible alternative explanation over the course of 8 decades and has survived every test intact. 2 witnesses, separated by 35 years of independent recollection, describing the same anomalous detail without access to each other's accounts. This is not proof of anything. It is important to be precise about that. 2 witnesses describing the same thing does not confirm that the thing they described existed in the form they described it, or existed at all in any objective sense. Human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstructive process, and reconstruction is always influenced by the needs and fears and frameworks of the person doing the reconstructing. What 2 independent witnesses describing the same detail does confirm is that the detail is not a product of simple confabulation or conscious fabrication, that both people are reporting something their memory has preserved, whether that preserved thing is an accurate record of an external event or an accurate record of an internal experience that their minds generated in response to circumstances of extreme stress and psychological intensity. Either possibility is interesting. Either possibility tells you something true about what happened at Harlan Creek, even if the 2 possibilities tell you different true things. This is the territory that the Harlan Creek story inhabits, not the clean, well-lit territory of confirmed fact, and not the irresponsible territory of invented mythology, but the genuinely difficult middle ground where honest inquiry has to be content with partial answers and productive uncertainty. Jesse Karn's 2009 documentary, which was titled simply Harlan Creek, and which received a limited release at several regional film festivals before finding a modest audience online, was the first sustained public engagement with the story since Patricia Gould's unpublished research. Karn was 29 years old when she made it, a recent film school graduate from Missoula with a personal connection to the subject. Her great-grandmother, a woman named Ruth Karn, née Holloway, had been among the residents of Harlan Creek in 1938,
and had spent the remainder of her long life declining to discuss what had happened there with anyone in the family, except apparently in a single conversation with Jesse's mother in 1991, the year before Ruth died. Jesse's mother had relayed the substance of this conversation to Jesse when Jessie was in her 20s, and it had done to Jessie exactly what the 3-paragraph mention in the gas station compendium had done to Patricia Gould 2 decades earlier. It had lodged in her in a way she could not dislodge, had become a persistent presence in her thinking that demanded engagement rather than accommodation. The detail Jesse's mother relayed from Ruth's 1991 conversation was not about the sound or the light or the mass departure into darkness. It was about something Ruth had apparently never mentioned to anyone before that conversation and had insisted, according to Jesse's mother, that Jesse's mother never repeat to anyone else. Jesse's mother repeated it anyway, eventually, to her daughter, because some information is too heavy to carry alone indefinitely, and eventually finds its way toward release regardless of the instructions attached to it. What Ruth Holloway Karn told her daughter-in-law in 1991, 53 years after the night in question, was that she had not left Harlan Creek immediately when the feeling came. She had hesitated. She had stood in the doorway of her cabin for what she estimated as several minutes, an eternity given what was happening around her, given that her neighbors were already moving past her on the road, and during those minutes she had looked directly toward Shaft 7. She could see the equipment housing structure clearly enough in the darkness, and she had seen the entrance to the shaft, the wooden-framed opening in the earth that the miners descended through each morning, and she had seen that the entrance was producing light. The wrong-colored light that Pollard and the 8-year-old Harold Voss would later describe independently, yes. But Ruth described something additional that neither of the other 2 accounts contain. She said the light was moving, not flickering the way fire moves, moving with direction and purpose, the way something moves when it is navigating rather than simply burning. Rising from the shaft opening in a slow, deliberate spiral, as if whatever was producing it was ascending, not quickly, not urgently, but with the patient, unhurried quality of something that has no reason to rush because it has already arrived where it intended to arrive. Ruth told her daughter-in-law that she had watched this for the entire duration of her hesitation in the doorway. She said she had not been able to look away, and she said that at some point during those minutes, the moving light had paused, had, as far as she could perceive it across the distance between her cabin and the shaft, oriented itself in her direction, and she had felt, in that moment, not the generalized certainty of danger that Agnes Pollard described, not the undifferentiated impulse to leave that seemed to have moved through the entire village simultaneously, but something specific and personal and direct. She felt perceived. She felt that whatever was producing that light was aware of her specifically, was registering her presence as an individual rather than as part of an undifferentiated mass of fleeing humans, was in some manner she could not define and did not attempt to define, noting her. And it was that feeling, not fear, she told Jesse's mother carefully, not exactly fear, that finally moved her feet and sent her down the road after her neighbors into the dark, into the dark. The documentary Jessie Karn made includes an interview with Harold Voss and an interview with Agnes Pollard's daughter, who shares her mother's memory of the 1974 conversation with Gould, but who did not herself witness the events of 1938. It includes archival photographs of Harlan Creek taken by Thomas Aldecott in the spring of 1939, images of an abandoned village in early thaw that carry the specific desolation of places humans have left in haste, the geometry of domesticity preserved without the warmth that made it domestic. It includes an interview with a geologist from the University of Montana who explains carefully and thoroughly all the natural phenomena that might theoretically account for some of what the Harlan Creek survivors described, and who is honest enough at the end of his explanation to acknowledge that the specific combination of reported experiences does not map cleanly onto any single natural phenomenon he can identify. The documentary does not conclude. It ends, appropriately, in the same condition of productive uncertainty where all honest engagement with this story eventually arrives, not with answers, but with the right questions held at the right temperature, warm enough to remain alive, cool enough not to burn through into the territory of irresponsible speculation.
The Consolidated Harlan Mining Company issued a single official statement regarding the evacuation of Harlan Creek, dated December 12, 1938, nearly a month after the event itself. The delay was not, as a charitable reading might suggest, the result of a thorough internal investigation requiring time to complete. Patricia Gould obtained a copy of internal company correspondence from the period through a Freedom of Information request filed in 1976, and the correspondence tells a different story, one of institutional paralysis, of senior officials in the Butte office exchanging memos that read less like the communications of people trying to understand what had happened, and more like the communications of people trying to determine how much of what had happened they were legally and reputationally obligated to acknowledge. The man at the center of this correspondence was the company's regional director, a man named Arthur Pennick, who had been with the company since 1919, and whose professional identity was so thoroughly constructed around the twin pillars of productivity and control that an event which had demolished both simultaneously appears to have produced in him something close to a personal crisis. His memos from the weeks following the evacuation have a quality of barely managed distress beneath their formal corporate language, a tendency toward repetition, a habit of asking the same questions in slightly different formulations, as if a different arrangement of words might produce a different answer, a recurring emphasis on the importance of ensuring that the company's public narrative remained consistent and contained. He used the word narrative explicitly in a 1938 internal memo, which tells you something about how clearly he understood that what the company was managing was not primarily a safety situation or an employment situation, but a story situation, a question of which version of events would achieve public circulation and which would not. The official statement, when it finally appeared, was a masterpiece of the genre. 4 paragraphs of corporate prose that acknowledged the evacuation, attributed it to a combination of worker anxiety related to underground gas detection concerns and the psychological pressures of an economically difficult period, noted that the company had conducted a thorough review of Shaft 7 and found no evidence of structural compromise or hazardous gas accumulation that would justify the level of response that had occurred, expressed regret for the disruption to workers and their families, and announced that Harlan Creek would be temporarily suspended pending a comprehensive safety review. The word temporarily was doing considerable work in that sentence. Harlan Creek never reopened. The comprehensive safety review, if it was ever conducted, produced no document that has entered any archive accessible to researchers. The company itself was absorbed into a larger mining conglomerate in 1947, and whatever institutional memory it carried about Harlan Creek was dissolved in that absorption as thoroughly as salt dissolves in water, present in the resulting solution in some technical sense, but no longer identifiable as a distinct substance. Arthur Pennock retired in 1951. He died in Butte in 1963. His personal papers, if he kept any, have not been located. What the official statement notably did not address was Dale Ferris. A man employed by the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company had disappeared from a company facility, had last been accounted for descending into a company shaft, and the company's official public statement about the events surrounding his disappearance contained no mention of his name. Margaret Ferris wrote to the company's Butte office 3 times between December 1938 and March 1939, requesting information about her husband's disappearance and asking what steps the company intended to locate him, or if location was not possible, to formally acknowledge his death and provide whatever compensation their employment agreement specified for workplace fatalities. She received 2 responses. The first, dated January 1939, expressed sympathy for her situation and indicated that the matter was under review. The second, dated February 1939, informed her that because Dale Ferris had not been confirmed present in Shaft 7 at the time of the evacuation, his lamp had been returned, the letter noted, suggesting he had surfaced prior to the events of November 14th. The company was unable to establish a direct causal connection between his disappearance and any workplace incident, and therefore could not process a workplace fatality claim. The returned lamp. The company had taken the one physical detail that most deepened the mystery of Dale Ferris's disappearance, a lamp replaced by a man who then vanished, and deployed it as an administrative mechanism for denying his widow compensation. Margaret Ferris did not write a third letter. She moved to Spokane. The historical record, as noted, loses her there. The ethical dimensions of the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company's response to the Harlan Creek evacuation are not subtle, and it would be easy to spend considerable time in their examination. But there is a more interesting question beneath the ethical one, a question that the company's behavior inadvertently raises by being so thoroughly focused on containment rather than investigation. The question is this: what did Arthur Pennock know that made containment feel more urgent than understanding? The internal memos Gould attained through her Freedom of Information request cover the period from November 15, 1938, through the issuance of the public statement on December 12. They reveal a man managing a public relations crisis with considerable sophistication. What they do not reveal, and this absence is itself a form of information, is any genuine curiosity about what had caused the crisis. Pennock's memos ask repeatedly how to characterize the event, how to limit the company's legal exposure, how to prevent the story from reaching major metropolitan newspapers. They do not ask what happened at Shaft 7. They do not ask what the miners heard. They do not ask what caused 212 people to abandon everything they owned and walk into mountain darkness in November. The absence of these questions in a man who was clearly intelligent enough to ask them suggests one of 2 possibilities.
Either Pennock genuinely did not want to know the answers, which is itself a psychologically revealing position, the choice of a man who has assessed the territory and decided that ignorance is preferable to knowledge, or he already knew enough that asking the questions formally would have created a documentary record of answers he needed to remain undocumented. Gould favored the second interpretation, and she made her case for it in her research journal with the careful, building logic of someone who has spent years assembling evidence. She pointed to the detail in the company correspondence that appears in a memo dated November 22, 1938, 8 days after the evacuation, 20 days before the public statement, in which Pennock references a conversation with the chief geological surveyor who had overseen the opening of Shaft 7 6 weeks earlier. The surveyor's name was Marcus Webb, and he was based in Butte rather than at Harlan Creek, visiting the site periodically to monitor the shaft's progress. Pennock's memo does not quote Webb directly. It summarizes, in the flattened, extractive way that memos summarize conversations, only the portions relevant to the administrative decisions being made. But within that summary, a single phrase survived that Gould returned to repeatedly in her journal, examining it from different angles the way you examine an object you cannot quite identify. Pennock writes that Webb indicated the geological profile of Shaft 7's lower sections had presented certain anomalies that Webb had chosen not to include in his formal survey reports, anomalies he described to Webb as outside the parameters of standard geological classification. Gould spent 3 months in the mid-1970s attempting to locate Marcus Webb. She established that he had left the mining industry entirely in early 1939, had relocated to the Pacific Northwest, and had died in Portland, Oregon in 1971, 3 years before Gould began her active research. His professional records from his time with the Consolidated Harlan Mining Company were not among the materials transferred to the conglomerate that absorbed the company in 1947. They do not appear to exist anywhere. Anomalies outside the parameters of standard geological classification. Whatever Marcus Webb found at the bottom of Shaft 7, he took it with him.
There is a particular kind of loneliness that attaches itself to people who carry knowledge they cannot share, not because they have been formally prohibited from sharing it, but because they have correctly assessed that the sharing would cost them more than the carrying. Marcus Webb appears to have been such a person. The outline of his post-Harlan Creek life, assembled from the fragmentary records Gould could locate, and supplemented by additional research conducted by a historian named Daniel Sherritt, who encountered the Harlan Creek story through Jesse Karn's documentary and spent several years pursuing it independently, suggests a man who made a series of deliberate choices after 1939 that collectively read as the choices of someone putting distance between himself and something he had encountered professionally and could not professionally process. He left the mining industry at 41, an age at which a man with his qualifications and experience would normally be approaching the peak of his career. He moved to Portland, a city he had no prior connection to, where he took a position teaching secondary school science, a significant downward step in both income and professional status that he apparently made without apparent reluctance. He never published anything about his geological work. He never gave interviews. He joined no professional associations, attended no industry conferences, maintained no documented contact with former colleagues. He lived in Cortland for 32 years, taught school, and died in 1971, leaving behind, according to the brief obituary in the Portland Oregonian that Daniel Sherritt located, a daughter named Carol, and a reputation among his students as an exceptionally dedicated teacher who had a particular gift for conveying the age and complexity of the earth to young people who had not yet learned to find such things interesting. Daniel Sherritt found Carol Webb in 2011. She was 73 years old, living in Eugene, Oregon, and she received his inquiry with a wariness that softened over the course of several exchanges into something closer to relief, the relief of someone who has been waiting, without consciously acknowledging the waiting, for a particular conversation to finally arrive. She told Sherritt that her father had never spoken to her directly about his work in Montana. She had known he had worked in mining geology, had known he had left the industry abruptly, had understood from the general atmosphere of her childhood that the transition was connected to something he did not discuss, rather than to any ordinary professional dissatisfaction. She had asked him once when she was in her 20s and had developed enough adult confidence to press where her childhood self had known not to, what had happened. He had looked at her for a long moment before answering. She remembered the look precisely, not evasive, not pained, but measuring, as if he were assessing whether she was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, or because she thought she wanted to know, understanding that these are not always the same thing. He had apparently concluded that she was asking the second kind of question, because what he told her was not an answer, but a redirection.
He said that there were things the Earth contained that human beings had not yet developed the conceptual framework to understand, and that the appropriate response to encountering such things was not to publicize the encounter, but to quietly withdraw from the vicinity and allow the thing encountered to remain where it was. He said this, Carroll told Sherritt, in the tone he used when he was teaching, calm, precise, not unkind, but not inviting further discussion either. She had not asked again. She had carried the non-answer for 50 years, and now, talking to Daniel Sherritt, she found she was able to describe it with a clarity that surprised her, as if the act of finally voicing it had revealed that it had been fully formed inside her all along, waiting for the right container. Sherritt published his research in 2014 in a long-form piece for an online journal dedicated to American historical mysteries, not an academic publication, but a carefully researched and responsibly written piece that drew on Gould's archived materials, Carnes' documentary, the sheriff's records, and his own original interviews, including the conversation with Carroll Webb. The piece attracted a modest but attentive readership and generated several responses from people who had their own connections to the Harlan Creek story, descendants of former residents, amateur researchers who had encountered fragments of the story in local historical collections, one retired geologist who had worked in the Bitterroot Range in the 1960s and who wrote to Sherritt with information about what he described as anomalous subsurface readings his team had recorded in the vicinity of the former Harlan Creek site that had never been satisfactorily explained. This geologist, who asked Sherritt not to use his name, and who Sherritt refers to in his subsequent writing only as the Bitterroot Contact, described the readings in technical language that Sherritt was not fully equipped to evaluate, but which he included in his piece with appropriate caveats. The Bitterroot Contact said the reading suggested the presence of an unusually large subsurface void at a depth significantly below the level Shaft 7 had reached in 1938, a void whose dimensions, as far as his equipment could estimate them, were substantially larger than any natural geological formation he had previously encountered in comparable terrain. He said the void appeared, based on the readings, to not be empty. He declined to speculate about what it contained. He said speculating would not be responsible given the limitations of the data. He said this with what Sherritt described as a firmness that suggested the firmness was not about the data's limitations, but about something else entirely. The same choice Marcus Webb had made 70 years earlier, the choice to withdraw from the vicinity and allow the thing encountered to remain where it was. The former site of Harlan Creek is accessible today, in the sense that no legal prohibition prevents a person from traveling to it. The mountain road that Gerald Purcell navigated in his company truck and Howard Bleck drove in his sheriff's vehicle has not been maintained since the late 1940s and is, depending on the season, somewhere between difficult and impassable. The structures of the village itself have been substantially reclaimed by the forest over the course of 8 decades. The combination of Montana winters, spring thaws, and the patient, indifferent work of vegetation means that what Thomas Aldecott photographed in 1939 bears little physical resemblance to what a visitor would find today. Several people over the years have made the journey, some out of historical curiosity, some drawn by the story itself, some for reasons they have not clearly articulated even to themselves. A handful have written about their visits online, in the informal, personal register of people processing an experience rather than reporting on it. These accounts are not evidence of anything in any strict sense, but they share, with a consistency that is at minimum worth noting, a quality of unease that their authors consistently struggle to attribute to anything specific. The forest. The silence. The way the remaining structural remainings sit in the landscape. One visitor, a woman who described herself as a hiking enthusiast with no particular interest in the paranormal, wrote that she had been at the site for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware of wanting very strongly to not be there anymore. Not afraid, she wrote, just absolutely certain, in a way she could not explain and did not try to explain, that she was somewhere she was not supposed to be. She left. She wrote that she has not gone back and does not intend to. She wrote that she thinks about it more than she expected to. She wrote that she has told a few people about the visit, and that none of them have asked the obvious follow-up question, the question she would have asked before she went there herself, the question of what specifically made her feel that way. Nobody asks, she wrote. It's like they already know not to.
There is a concept in geology called a threshold event. The moment when accumulated pressure, building incrementally over time, in increments too small to register individually, reaches the precise point at which the containing structure can no longer hold and releases everything at once. The term is technical, descriptive, morally neutral. It does not assign intention to the pressure or to the release. It simply names the mechanics of a process that the Earth performs constantly in scales ranging from the microscopic to the continental, without reference to what happens to be situated at the surface when the release occurs. Marcus Webb used geological language when he spoke to his daughter about what he had encountered at Harlan Creek. He spoke of things the Earth contained. He spoke of conceptual frameworks. He spoke of withdrawal as the appropriate response. He was a geologist by training and by identity, and the vocabulary of geology was the vocabulary most available to him when he reached for language adequate to his experience. But the language of geology, as he himself apparently understood, was not quite adequate. The things the earth contained in his formulation were not entirely geological things. They were things that required a framework the geological discipline did not possess. He taught secondary school science for 32 years rather than develop that framework professionally. This was, perhaps, the most honest choice available to him. The development of a framework for things outside the parameters of standard classification is not work that institutions support or careers survive. It is work that happens, when it happens at all, in private journals and late-night conversations, and the quiet, persistent thinking of people who have encountered something that will not leave them alone. Dr. Ellsworth Crane developed his own private framework in the years following the evacuation of Harlan Creek, and unlike Marcus Webb, he did not entirely keep it to himself. Crane had relocated to Missoula after the evacuation, resuming medical practice there, and had maintained his habit of journal keeping throughout the remainder of his life. When he died in 1959, his journals, 31 volumes covering his entire adult life, the 17 recovered pages from Harlan Creek representing only a fragment of a much larger document, were inherited by his son, a man named Frederick Crane, who was a literature professor at the University of Montana and who had the instincts of an archivist rather than a destroyer. Frederick Crane kept his father's journals intact and eventually donated the complete collection to the university library, where they were cataloged and made available to researchers beginning in 1978. Patricia Gould was among the first researchers to access them, and what she found in the volumes covering the period from 1939 through the mid-1940s significantly deepened her understanding of the Harlan Creek story, not because Crane revealed new factual information about the events of November 14, 1938, but because his journals document the process of a precise, clinically trained mind working through an experience it cannot accommodate within its existing structures and slowly, reluctantly, building new ones. Crane wrote about Harlan Creek extensively in the years immediately following the evacuation. He wrote about the miners he had treated, the sounds they had described, the psychological deterioration he had observed in some of them during the weeks preceding the departure. He wrote about Dale Ferris with a specificity and a grief that suggests the man's disappearance weighed on him in ways that went beyond professional concern. Crane had known Ferris personally, had treated him for a minor injury 2 months before he vanished, had found him to be exactly the kind of straightforwardly decent man whose disappearance without explanation feels like an offense against the basic orderliness of things. He wrote about the night of November 14th itself, his own experience of it, the sound he had heard in the medical station walls, the feeling of certainty that had moved him out of the building and down the road, the strange calm of the mass departure, the darkness, the cold. He wrote about the light, briefly and with considerable hedging. He was not certain he had seen it, he noted, was not certain his mind had not supplied it in retrospect, was not certain the distinction mattered. And then, beginning in late 1939 and continuing through the early 1940s, his journal entries shift and register. He stops describing what happened and starts asking what it means, which is a different kind of writing entirely, more searching, less controlled, more willing to follow an idea into uncomfortable territory and sit there without immediately retreating. He read widely during this period. His journal references books on geology, on acoustics, on the psychology of collective behavior, on the history of mining disasters, and the documented psychological responses to underground trauma. He read anthropological accounts of indigenous relationships with the land in the American West, finding in some of them descriptions of certain places and certain subsurface locations that carried warnings not entirely unlike the experience of Harlan Creek. Places where the boundary between the world humans inhabited and whatever lay beneath it was considered to be thinner than elsewhere. Places where the appropriate human response was exactly what Marcus Webb had prescribed: withdrawal, distance, the maintenance of a respectful non-engagement. He read these accounts not as a man looking for supernatural validation of his experience, but as a man looking for precedent, for evidence that other human beings, in other times and other frameworks, had encountered something similar, and had developed ways of thinking about it that did not require either the denial of the experience or the abandonment of rational inquiry. He found enough precedent to conclude that what had happened at Harlan Creek was not unprecedented in the larger human record, only in the specific institutional memory of the mining company that had drilled into it, and the law enforcement apparatus that had been asked to explain it. The Earth had been telling people for a very long time that certain of its interior spaces were not available for human entry. The mining industry had simply not developed a mechanism for receiving that communication. By 1944, Crane's journal entries on the subject had arrived at a position he described as his working hypothesis, offered with the explicit caveat that hypothesis was perhaps too confident a word for something he could not test, and would not attempt to test.
He wrote that he had come to believe Shaft 7 had penetrated a boundary, not a geological boundary in any standard sense, not a fault line or a gas pocket or a subterranean water table, but something for which geology did not have a name, because geology had not previously needed one. A boundary between the portion of the Earth's interior that was, in some functional sense, empty, available for human excavation, consistent with human presence, operating according to the physical laws that human science had documented, and a portion that was not empty. Not in the way that rock is not empty, or water is not empty. Not empty in a way that Crane, even after years of working toward adequate language, could not fully articulate. He wrote that the sounds the miners had heard were not produced by anything mechanical or geological, but were the acoustic consequence of proximity. The noise of being close to something very large that existed in a register the human sensory apparatus was not designed to process directly, bleeding through into the range of human hearing as something rhythmic and even and patient, because rhythmic and evenness and patience were the qualities of whatever was producing it, filtered through the imperfect translation of rock and distance into the only form the human ear could receive. He wrote that the light seen by multiple witnesses during the evacuation was the visual equivalent of the same phenomenon, not light in any electromagnetic sense, but presence rendered partially visible at the threshold point, at the moment of crossing, in the only visual register available to human perception. He wrote that whatever had been in that space had not followed the evacuating population, had not pursued them, had not been aggressive or predatory in any way that the evidence suggested, had simply been where it was, had been disturbed by the drilling that brought human beings into close proximity to it, and had eventually moved through the boundary that the drilling had compromised, in a way that made continued human habitation of the site untenable, not through violence, but through the simple, overwhelming fact of its presence, in a space that human nervous systems were not equipped to share. He wrote all of this in a private journal that he did not share with anyone during his lifetime. He was a doctor in Missoula, Montana in the 1940s. There was no one to share it with. The question that Crane's hypothesis raises, and that everyone who has spent serious time with the Harlan Creek story eventually arrives at, is the question of scale. If the subsurface void identified by the Bitterroot contact in the 1960s is as large as the anomalous reading suggested, and the contact's reluctance to speculate about its contents implies a man who had formed his own conclusions and found them too large to voice, then what Shaft 7 penetrated was not a small or local phenomenon. What Shaft 7 penetrated was something of a size and a nature that makes the specific geography of the Bitterroot Mountains feel less like a location and more like a coordinate, a single point in a much larger topology that human beings have been moving across the surface of for the entirety of their existence without understanding what lay beneath them. Crane's working hypothesis was built from 17 miners' testimonies and his own experience and 30 years of private reading. It was the best framework one very intelligent man could construct from the materials available to him. Whether it is correct, whether it is even approximate to act, is a question that no one with the institutional resources to investigate it has shown any interest in pursuing. The mining company buried the story. The sheriff filed an inconclusive report. The geologist took early retirement and taught children about the age of the earth without telling them what he had found in it. And the earth itself, as it always does, simply continued. Patient, vast, indifferent to the frameworks humans build to contain their understanding of it, keeping whatever it keeps in the spaces that the drill bits have not yet reached, and the maps have not yet named.
We began this journey with an image. Dinner plates still warm, coffee still steaming in tin cups, a village frozen mid-breath at the precise second before something irreversible occurred. I want to return to that image now, at the end, not to resolve it, but to look at it differently. The way you look at a photograph you have been carrying for a long time and suddenly notice a detail in the background that you somehow failed to register in every previous examination. The detail is this: the people of Harlan Creek came back for nothing. Not one of the 212 residents of that village returned to collect their belongings, their money, their photographs, their children's toys, the accumulated physical evidence of their lives in that place. They walked away in the dark in November in Montana, and they kept walking, and they did not go back. People return for things. It is one of the most consistent and deeply human behaviors in the historical record of disaster and displacement. Even in the aftermath of events that have destroyed everything, people return to the site of destruction to stand in the wreckage and look for something salvageable, something to carry forward, some physical continuity between the life that existed before and the life that must now be constructed after. The people of Harlan Creek did not do this. They had not lost their possessions to fire or flood or structural collapse. Their cabins were standing. Their belongings were intact. The commissary still had food in it. The schoolhouse still had the children's drawings pinned to the wall. Everything was there, waiting, and none of them went back for any of it. This is not the behavior of people who were frightened and then recovered their equilibrium and made rational calculations about the costs and benefits of return. This is the behavior of people for whom the calculation was so simple and so absolute that it required no deliberation at all. Whatever was in Harlan Creek was more important to avoid than everything they owned was worth retrieving. That is a statement about the nature of the thing they encountered that no testimony, no journal entry, no geological survey has managed to make as clearly. Agnes Pollard left papers she had been grading. Corcoran Blythe left the tools he had carried underground every day for years, objects that working men of that era treated with a care and a personal attachment that reflected their understanding that good tools were not easily replaced. Margaret Ferris left everything except her children, which tells you exactly and precisely where her assessment of the hierarchy of what mattered ended. She drew the line at her children, and everything else fell on the other side of it without apparent hesitation or regret. Bertram Lyle, the commissary cook from Chicago, left a kitchen he had organized according to his own particular system over 5 years of daily occupation, a space that represented more genuine domesticity than almost anywhere else in the village. He told Sheriff Black in his December statement that he had not thought once about the kitchen as he walked away. Not once. He said this with what Black's notes describe as a tone of mild wonder, as if the absence of the thought surprised him in retrospect, as if he was only now, weeks later, noticing that a concern which had structured his daily life for 5 years had simply ceased to exist at the moment it encountered something larger than itself. This is what genuine encounters with the incomprehensible do to human priorities. They do not frighten us into irrationality. They clarify us. They strip away the constructed importance of the things we have decided matter and reveal, with a precision that ordinary life never quite achieves, what we are actually willing to die for and what we are not. The people of Harlan Creek discovered that they were not willing to die for any of it. And they had understood, in the wordless, pre-rational way that the body understands things before the mind has assembled the language to explain them, that remaining in Harlan Creek was a form of dying. The story of Harlan Creek does not belong to the category of historical mysteries that await resolution. It belongs to a different category, smaller, more uncomfortable, more honest about the limits of what human inquiry can achieve. It belongs to the category of things that happened, that were witnessed by real people whose accounts survive in archives and recorded conversations and private journals, that have been investigated by researchers whose integrity and methodology deserve respect, and that remain, despite all of this, outside the boundaries of what can be conclusively explained. This category is larger than our cultural preference for resolution would suggest. We have built an entire architecture of narrative, in journalism, in documentary filmmaking, in the true crime genre that has become one of the dominant storytelling forms of the contemporary moment, around the premise that investigation leads to conclusion, that sufficient research will always eventually produce an answer adequate to the question. Harlan Creek resists this architecture, not because the research has been insufficient, but because the question itself is not the kind of question that research of the available variety can answer. What was in Shaft 7? What produced the sound that 17 miners described to Dr. Crane? What generated the light that Agnes Pollard and Harold Voss and Ruth Holloway Carn independently described from their separate positions in the darkness of November 14, 1938? What did Ruth feel perceiving her from across the distance between her cabin doorway and the shaft entrance? What did Marcus Webb find in the geological profile of Shaft 7's lower sections that he chose not to include in his formal reports and carried silently for the remainder of his professional life? What is in the subsurface void that the Bitterroot Contact's instruments detected in the 1960s, a void too large for standard classification, described by a retired geologist as not empty, in a way he declined to elaborate on? These questions do not have answers that the available evidence can support. They have only the questions themselves, and the accumulated weight of human testimony pointing toward a space in the earth that human beings approached, and then, with a unanimity and a completeness that speaks for itself, decided to leave alone. Dr. Crane's working hypothesis, that Shaft 7 penetrated a boundary between the portion of the Earth's interior that human presence is compatible with, and a portion that it is not a scientific conclusion.
he would have been the first to insist on this distinction. It is the best framework one very careful, very honest mind could construct from incomplete evidence and inadequate language, and it has the quality of all frameworks built under those conditions. It illuminates something without fully enclosing it, casts light on the shape of the problem without resolving the problem into the kind of clean, graspable form that allows you to set it down and move on. You cannot set the Harlan Creek story down and move on. This is the experience of everyone who has spent serious time with it. Gould, who dedicated nearly a decade of her life to it, Carn, who made it the subject of her first significant creative work, Sherritt, who followed it for years after he first encountered it, Carol Webb, who carried her father's non-answer for 50 years waiting for someone to arrive who was asking the right question. The story does not release you because it does not conclude, and it does not conclude because the thing at its center, whatever was below Shaft 7, whatever rose through that entrance on the night of November 14, 1938, whatever was perceived by Ruth Holloway Carn standing in her cabin doorway with her feet finally moving toward the road, that thing is not resolved. It is not gone. It is not explained. It is simply where it is, in the dark beneath the Bitterroot Mountains, in a space the maps do not name, and the drills have not returned to, patient in the way that things are patient when they have no conception of time as a constraint, when waiting costs nothing because duration itself means something different at the depth and in the register where they exist. The village of Harlan Creek is forest now. The cabins have collapsed into their foundations. The commissary walls have been absorbed into the undergrowth. The schoolhouse where Agnes Pollard pinned her students' drawings is a suggestion of timber beneath decades of fallen leaves. The entrance to Shaft 7, the wooden-framed opening in the earth through which Dale Ferris descended and did not return, through which the sound rose for weeks before the night of the light, is covered. Whether by deliberate action or by the patient accumulation of debris that the mountain produces without effort or intention, it is covered. The forest does not mark the location. There is no sign, no memorial, no acknowledgement in the landscape that 212 people lived here and left here and never came back. The Bitterroot Mountains do not commemorate the things that have happened in them. They simply continue, as mountains do, indifferent to the human stories accumulated in their folds, indifferent to Eliza Whitlock and Agnes Pollard, and Dale Ferris, and Marcus Webb, and all the others who passed through and were changed by what they found here, indifferent to the researchers and the filmmakers, and the late-night listeners who have come to this story from the distance of decades, and found themselves unable to leave it entirely behind. The mountains continue. The forest continues. And somewhere beneath it, in a space that has no name in any human language, and no entry in any geological survey that has been allowed to reach a public archive, something continues too. What it is, we do not know. Whether it is aware of us, as Ruth Holloway Carn believed it was briefly aware of her, we do not know. Whether the barrier that Shaft 7 compromised in 1938 has fully restored itself, or whether it remains, in some way imperceptible from the surface, slightly thinner than it was before, we do not know. We know only that 212 people heard something and felt something and saw something, and left everything they owned behind without a second thought, and that this, in the end, may be the most precise and most honest description of it that human language can produce. Not a name, not an explanation, just the evidence of what it cost to be near it, and the absolute unanimity, unspoken human verdict that the cost was too high to pay twice. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. The darkness, as always, holds more than the light reveals. Sleep well, if you can.